In 1966, the American political strategist Dick Tuck, yes, that was his name, grow up, ran for a seat in the California State Senate. Upon being told that he had lost the Democratic Party primary, he uttered a remark which has passed into political legend. "The people have spoken. The bastards." In 2024, more politicians will have gnashed similar sentiments than in any other year in history. Nearly half of Earth's population in more than 70 countries had the opportunity to vote, and in a great many of those jurisdictions, they voted the incumbents out. This is not to suggest that none of these voters had no good reason for their discontent. As this year's episodes of The Foreign Desk reflected, we live in a world of trouble, much of which is the responsibility of the people who run it. Sometimes when the people speak, they are within their rights to offer directions to the door. It may not just be that, however. Though it would be a brave elected politician who pointed it out, hefty cohorts among Democratic electorates have embraced a creed of permanent performative unhappiness, encouraged by social media platforms and by cynical populists. A tendency has developed to want the fight, not the victory, to wallow in the crisis rather than consider a solution. This special episode of The Foreign Desk reads the runes scattered by this year's whirlwind of elections to see what they tell us about the year we've just had. Are we all really as unhappy as we seem to think? What do these results tell us about the state of the world more generally? And who were our panel's heroes and villains of 2024? This is The Foreign Desk.
It's not that democracy itself is on the retreat. I think that that's a wrong diagnosis. It's more democracy is not delivering for the people, the citizenry, and that's the issue that has to be addressed.
The framing that the Democrats used was that this was a referendum on the future of democracy, and it turned out that nobody cared.
From where I think we sit, the world is far more dangerous. We have a four-part authoritarian axis working together in a way that wasn't as clear this time last year.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller, and we're joined first of all by Tony Banbury, President and CEO of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, which is based in Washington, D.C. and promotes better elections and democracy around the world. Tony, welcome to our studio. I want to start first of all by talking about relatively recent events in South Korea. Does something like that, i.e. the president trying to declare martial law and the parliament and people basically getting together to say, no, you don't. Does it strike you as a heartening demonstration of the resilience of democracy, that it does stand up even when the person allegedly at the top of it tries to undermine it?
Yes, it does. It was very encouraging to see the response, not just of the political opposition that had a particular stake in it, but the society as a whole, and simple people from outside Seoul getting on buses and cars, driving into the city to protect their democracy. And it's a reflection of the strong democratic culture that has developed in South Korea since the end of the military regime. So it was very encouraging. We see something a little bit analogous in the response of people in Ukraine to the full-scale Russian invasion there. Even in Myanmar, how civil society is fighting back, accountants, nurses, teachers, taking up arms to defend their democracy. And at the heart of the work that I do and so many others do is really trying to help develop that democratic culture in countries around the world.
Because there isn't a narrative, a slightly bleak and pessimistic one, which you will be aware of, that democracy is in retreat, that people don't value it in quite the way they once did. Do you go along with that or not?
Not really. I think people value democracy greatly when it's meeting their needs and expectations. The problem isn't so much democracy, it's those who have taken power through democratic elections, but then do not demonstrate the commitment that is necessary to meet the basic needs of the citizenry, particularly economics. People need to put food on the table, and security. And whether it's a very poor country or wealthy country, where people feel like those things are not being met, their government's not delivering, then they're going to chase the incumbents out. We saw that recently in the United States, where people felt that on economic matters, on security matters, that Mr. Trump would be a better candidate than or president than Vice President Harris. But we see it in country after country. And so it's not that democracy itself is on the retreat. I think that's the wrong diagnosis. It's more democracy is not delivering for the people, the citizenry, and that's the issue that has to be addressed.
I mean, you've raised there a point I did want to get into, which is that this great carnival of democracy we have witnessed in 2024 has almost without exception, I think the Republic of Ireland maybe just counts as an exception, almost without exception has gone incredibly badly for the incumbents. And obviously that's how democracy is supposed to work. If you don't like the people in charge, toss them out and give some other mob a crack at it. But does it not strike you that so much of that happening demonstrates perhaps an impatience among electorates, which in the long run might be incompatible with democracy? Because we see that already in this country, the United Kingdom, where there was a change of government in July, and you already kind of get a sense of people thinking they've been in charge 4 months, why haven't they fixed everything?
And that's very common and has been for a long time, where people get frustrated with incumbents. In order to win an election, candidates promise a lot of things, and then when they get in office, of course, governing is difficult, delivering is difficult. Maybe they get focused on other things and not delivering on the promises they've made. And so there is this back and forth of a pendulum swing. In the past few years, though, that has been particularly pronounced. In the 25 wealthiest countries that had elections in the past 2 years, more than 70% of the incumbents were thrown out. There was a lot of change elections that brought in big change. You mentioned UK, US, of course, being another one just this year. But the difference now compared to before is, at least in some countries, the pendulum is swinging higher. It's not just that it's going back and forth between one party or another. It's that the party on one side or the other is further to the extreme. And so we're seeing societies sort of lurch back and forth a bit more than they have in the past.
What do you attribute that to, though? I mean, my own pet theory would be that social media has both amplified and encouraged dissatisfaction and amplified and encouraged extreme views. There's not a lot of space amid that hurly-burly for somebody to stand on the centre ground and go, well, hang on, can we just all be reasonable about this?
100% agree. That's a very serious issue. It's eroding democratic culture. Now, in countries around the world, U.S., Indonesia, both of which had very important elections this year, young people get most of their information, I won't say news, but information from TikTok, from YouTube. So young people are more and more disconnected from democratic institutions, societies, practices, and instead relying on social media. They're picking up their information from it and basing their decisions on very narrow understandings or shallow understandings of very important issues.
I mean, is there a worry, though, about where that might lead? Or, I mean, can we hold out any optimism at all that there might be this sort of collective idea descending of people going, no, actually, hang on, this does all sound a bit simplistic and divisive and probably not actually how the world works. I should find out more about this.
I think we definitely have to be worried as to where it might lead, but there are things to do about it. It's important to meet voters and citizens where they are. So candidates, for instance, who ignore the very lived reality of people whose financial situation is deteriorating. They can't afford increased housing costs or gasoline prices. That's a mistake, and I think a lot of political analysts in the U.S. would say that was a big mistake that was made by the Harris campaign. Also, where young people are getting information, we have to recognize that youth around the world are not consuming news the way people used to. Newspapers, television, radio. It's this social media, different platforms that are the sources of information. And it's really important for political candidates or those who are supporting democratic culture to understand that and meet the information consumers and the voters where they are.
That was Tony Banbury, President and CEO of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller, and joining me now for a broader view of 2024 are Yossi Mekelberg, Senior Consulting Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House, Latika Bourke, Writer-at-Large for Australian publication The Nightly, and Charles Hecker, Political Risk Analyst and author of Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia. Hello to all of you.
Hello.
Hello, Andrew.
As ever, when we look back on a year in which loads of stuff tends to happen, it is kind of hard to know where to start. But we have sort of queued this discussion up with the previous interview about elections, which were a dominant theme of this year. And Latika, I'll start with you. Of this year's enormous democracy fest, were there any results that particularly surprised you?
Absolutely. India for me. I was there at the start of the year, and what you could not detect from the anecdotal conversations that you would have with everyday Indians on the street was the silent, I guess we talk a lot about silent majorities, but I do think in India's case, that chastening result for Narendra Modi showed that sometimes pollsters don't pick up things. When you oversee climates where free speech or freedom of expression is subdued. And that, for me, was the big surprise. And I also think it was a very healthy result for Indian democracy.
Well, on the subject, Charles, of pollsters not picking things up, you are here, of course, to answer for every single decision made by your fellow American citizens in 2024. Obviously, we know what the result was, and we don't need, I don't think, to rehash the many and varied reasons why you wouldn't vote for Donald Trump. But what is your assessment of why so many of your fellow Americans did?
Yeah, this is what's so interesting about the U.S. elections, because the framing that the Democrats used was that this was a referendum on the future of democracy, and it turned out that nobody cared. Donald Trump was meant to be the end of free and fair elections in the United States. And actually, there was a scenario under which even on this date, we might not have known the results, and there was a legitimate reason to believe that the elections would wind up sooner or later in the Supreme Court. That didn't happen. And so at least that democratic exercise remains relatively robust in the United States, although probably partly so because Trump won. And that removes one of the primary sources of the challenge to the legitimacy of the elections. But beyond that, what we learned in the sort of hyper-dramatic aftermath of Trump's victory among Democrats, is that Trump struck on the issues that matter to people most. And his oft-repeated phrase of, do you feel that you are better off now than you were when I was president? And people tended, whether they were right or wrong, they relied on their gut and they said, we're not any better off. Never mind that while Trump was president during the pandemic, he was telling people to drink bleach, which doesn't make you feel very good one way or the other. But he hit on these pocketbook issues that resonate with American voters far more than apparently high-minded issues like the future of democracy.
And Yossi, to bring you in, we should also talk about one country which did have an election which went quite badly for the conservative populist tendency, which was the country from which we are broadcasting, where Sir Keir Starmer led Labour to a thumping victory in July. Does that strike you as globally something of an aberration, or was it just one of those things that happened isolated from anything else? Was it just a thing where one party had been in charge for ages and everybody was sick of them?
I think it's a combination. We have to remember that the electoral system here, of first past the post, a victory looks much better than actually the popular vote.
What matters is not so much how many votes you get, but where you get them.
Exactly. You can have absolute power with very few votes more than your rival. You just need in every constituency single vote more than your rival, and you take the entire power. So there is something, at the end of the day, Labour won with 34% of the popular vote. Not to take away from this great success, considering that in 2019, Conservative had the majority of 80, and it looks solid, but they managed to basically to destroy any support by having 3 prime ministers through their term, 2 of them actually not elected by the populace, but elected by the party. One of them, in this case, only by the MPs. And yes, there is fatigue when a government, when a party is 14 years in power. And through this, went through Brexit, was a total disaster. Then COVID and the COVID investigation, the economy not doing well. Then Liz Truss, which managed within less than 2 months to completely bring the economy down. Are we surprised that Labour won so decisively? Having said that, the 6 months of Labour haven't been exactly easy, and there's already criticism, and you look at the approval rates are very low.
I do want to broaden the chat out a bit beyond elections, because the remit of the Foreign Desk, and there is a clue in the name, tends to be events outside the country from which we broadcast. Latika, I'll start by asking about Ukraine, because this has been a dominant theme of the last 3 years now, and I guess this is a question that we could reasonably have asked at the end of 2022 or 2023 as well. Are you surprised to see it still undefeated, still standing?
Yes and no, because I think we are moving into a different phase of talking about what battleground Ukraine looks like. I think we're moving into a very different phase about what victory looks like. Don't forget, 2.5 years ago, victory meant taking Crimea, all of the Donbass, no equivocation. Now we're having a very different, nuanced conversation about victory potentially looking like a frozen front line. Maybe a part of Ukraine gets security guarantees. It's not going to get NATO immediately, if ever. Maybe part of Ukraine gets EU accession or a process towards it. But these are very different sets of conversations we're having. So I'm not surprised that Ukraine has valiantly kept up its fight at huge, huge cost to Ukraine, of course, and to Russia. I think, though, that our understanding of the costs and the balance and the ledger is a bit different, because from where I think we sit, the world is far more dangerous. We have a 4-part authoritarian axis working together in a way that wasn't as clear this time last year, Andrew, when we spoke. And that, to me, doesn't overall lead to any pats on the back for us or necessarily even Ukraine at the end of it.
Charles, on the subject of that authoritarian axis, one thing that definitely did change on battleground Ukraine this year was Russia drawing upon its North Korean allies, not just for ammunition, but for actual troops who have been reported fighting and indeed dying in substantial numbers in Kursk, and that was another development, of course, this year, Ukraine actually helping itself to a small chunk of Russian territory. If you reflect back just on the last 12 months, though, for Vladimir Putin, we know none of this has gone according to his plan, because his original plan was to be, strolling through the streets of Kiev in a blizzard of rose petals within 72 hours of giving the go order. But are you surprised at how he has endured?
No. I was going to try to start with a yes, because under certain circumstances or under similar circumstances, lots of other leaders would be gone by now. But there is very little in the way, with one exception that I'll get to in 2 seconds. There is very little in the way of Vladimir Putin right now, and that is that there is no opposition in Russia. What opposition exists in the diaspora is disorganized and unable to really present any sort of united anti-Putin front. And whoever remains in Russia that wants him out is not yet in a position to sort of voice those emotions. And certainly no one yet has the internal leverage to get rid of him. The only thing that stands between Putin and the rest of his future right now is not a military threat and isn't Ukraine. It's the economy. The greatest pressure on him right now is an economy that is creaking mightily under the weight of the war economy. He is on the verge, or believed to be on the verge, of sacking the head of the central bank. And that's the one thing that everybody's watching most carefully, and that is that if she goes, Elvira Nabiullina, if she's out, then the economy becomes even more unpredictable than it is now.
At which we should turn to the Middle East, which not for the first time in human history was a scene of considerable drama. And I mean, I think of all the events, Yossi, that probably nobody would have seen coming roughly this time last year. And I haven't gone back to our year ahead episode at the start of this year to see if anybody did see it coming. But would you have banked on Bashar al-Assad beginning his days of exile in Moscow while the rebels waltzed down the M5 highway in Syria and took Damascus in a week?
The honest answer, no. And actually, I banked on him going 13 years ago during the Arab Spring. I thought, when Mubarak and Gaddafi and Ben Ali, all of them, one after another, like the house of cards just fell one after another, I was almost sure, and I said it in public, that Bashar al-Assad was next. Obviously, I got it wrong. But again, the idea that we always know that these regimes are vulnerable. Mm-hmm. The question when it happens. And it's always the balance between the willingness of the regime to fight and those who oppose it, the capability to challenge it, and to be brave enough in doing that. And I think what we saw in Syria is a combination of all of that, in addition to what happened to Hezbollah in Lebanon, weakening Iran. So in a way, you can go all the way back to October 7 of 2023, and you see the chain of events. Add to this Turkey's role there, Russia's role in Ukraine, and not ready to invest so much of its military capital in Syria, and you have all of kind of what makes a successful revolution. The question is also obviously what happens next. Who takes control? Syria is a complex country. There are a group of minorities there. They feel threatened right now, or at least they're scared what's going to happen next. So Israel already took some parts of Syria. Turkey is in control of the other. Is it going to, all of them going to let Syria to establish a new Syria which allow all minorities to be part of it, or are moving with something that many are really concerned about, some sort of fundamentalist Sunni country?
Latika, do we have to consider, do you think, the richly ironic possibility that inadvertently or otherwise Benjamin Netanyahu may have been the midwife of the Syrian revolution? Because it was surely the decapitation of Hezbollah in Lebanon this year, first by that extraordinary wave of exploding pages and then by the assassination of most of Hezbollah's high command, that kicked away Assad's principal defence.
Yes and no. Again, I hate to do this to you, Andrew. I think yes, you're right. Absolutely. Benjamin Netanyahu, in his assaults on Hezbollah, has considerably weakened Iran. There's no doubt about that. But if you look at what Jalani, the leader of HTS, has been saying, they have been plotting this for more than a year. Mm-hmm. And what actually triggered the final step or their alarm was the prospect of leaders in the region normalising ties with Assad. So that's something quite separate and something quite particular to the Syrian people.
Because this was a thing that was starting to happen. He'd been welcomed back into the Arab League and so on.
Exactly. And you don't have to go too far. Yossi, you'll know more than me, but you don't have to scratch the surface very deeply to find there were a lot of leaders who were starting to talk about this. A lot of diplomats were starting to talk about maybe it is time to put the hand of friendship back out to Assad. Now, that seems to have been more of a galvanising force with, I think, Benjamin Netanyahu ably assisting in terms of distracting the region, certainly distracting Iran and Lebanon, and then ultimately enabling the perfect climate of conditions for the rebels to mount their rebellion.
Yossi, I do want to come back to the subject of Israel at the heart of all this, though, because is it any clearer to you now than it was this time last year where Netanyahu sees as the endgame of what Israel has embarked upon since October 7th, 2023, both in terms of, destroying Hamas in Gaza, destroying Hezbollah in Lebanon, attempting to sort of make Syria less of a potential threat to Israel, and also taking on the Iran-supplied Houthis in Yemen. And this is, of course, the year that Israel has itself twice come under serious attack from Iran directly. Do you yet understand where Netanyahu thinks all this is leading?
I don't think there was a grand strategy, because Israel was caught by complete surprise on 7th of October, and we thought that the first 8-9 months, the focus was on Gaza, and throughout this, still no ceasefire, hostages are still in captivity. And there were some others within the IDF and the defense minister at the time, Yoav Gallant, that thought that the focus should be in Lebanon, because this Lebanon Hezbollah, as an extension of Tehran, of Iran, was the main focus, the main threat to Israel. But this was not Netanyahu's decision. They talk about total victory in Gaza and Hamas. It took until September, the pager. I happened to be there at the time when the pagers go off and everyone was caught by surprise, that they decided to shift when they saw that most of the Hamas brigade were destroyed in Gaza, to move to Lebanon. And one of the reasons, as I was told by senior commanders there, is that they saw that by allowing Hezbollah to keep part of the north completely empty, or 90% of the population displaced, was a strategic victory, both Hezbollah and Iran, and they couldn't tolerate. Then was this shift. And surprisingly, Hezbollah in many ways collapsed much, much quicker than expected.
Charles, the war in the Middle East did obviously become a factor in the US presidential election. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, once she became the candidate, both were criticized heavily for being overly indulgent of Israel, even as it became increasingly apparent that the United States was running out of patience with Israel, and even as it has always been apparent that Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu absolutely cannot stand each other. But was there anything that the United States could have done that would have made really any difference to anything on the ground?
No, I think the short answer to that, and probably the long answer to that, is no. You're right. There was absolutely no effective means of communication between Biden and his administration and Netanyahu and the people that he was relying on to conduct the war. And, for everybody who thought that a vote for Biden was a vote to sort of indulge Israel or prolong the war or support the war, or found him too soft on Netanyahu, I think they're in for a big surprise when Trump takes the oath of office on January 20th. I think that Netanyahu is feeling quite empowered by Trump's victory in the United States. I think Trump is going to give him a very, very long leash for his conduct in the Middle East. And I think that this explains some of the way he's pursuing military and political policies now, both on the domestic and on the foreign fronts. So, no, not a very effective relationship in a negative way under Biden, and a probably much more indulgent administration coming up.
I want to close finally with a couple of relatively rapid-fire questions. I'll ask you each in turn. You first, Latika. What didn't we pay enough attention to that probably we should have?
I do think India continues to be an underreported and an underappreciated rising power. And I think there is not enough understanding and outreach and diplomatic intensity in the West's relations with India. And I think next year that's certainly something that I'd be looking at to if I was in governments, I think I'd be putting a lot more energy in there.
Charles?
When was the last time a high-level American political delegation went to China? I think, we've been paying attention to China. It's one of the only areas that you get consensus between Democrats and Republicans in Washington. But I think that Russia-Ukraine, and I think that Israel-Gaza, and now everything else that's happening in the Middle East has been I don't want to categorize these as distractions. They're important regional conflicts with global implications. It's time to refocus on China.
Yossi?
I don't look at country or region that we don't pay attention, but the issue that as a result lead to the conflict. So when we don't address climate change, we don't address human rights, right for self-determination, then the result of it is the kind of issues that we just discussed, because that's the root causes of this conflict. So we look to the issues, the principles, the values, and then apply them to these places.
And finally, I'll go round the table again. And I want to allow you each the hugely entertaining opportunity to pick your hero of the year and your even more entertaining opportunity to pick a villain. Charles?
I think that the era of political hero worship is over. And I'm going to say that there isn't anybody out there who I think has sort of, is wearing the cape of the caped crusader and setting the world to rights. I think that we've all lost faith in politics and the political process, and that potential heroes are not going into politics anymore. Villain of the year, I won't even say his name, but it's somebody who runs a very, very large social media network. And just and before I get sort of watch my phone blow up here on the table in the studio.
Your account just been cancelled.
Exactly. I will be canceled. My account will be canceled, and I probably won't be able to place a local phone call. But I'm kind of thinking in that direction.
Yossi?
So my hero of the year is Alexei and Yulia Navalny. And I think Navalny was one of the few people that knew exactly what's going to happen to him. And he was a hero. He went back because he wanted to make a point that someone needs to lead the opposition to Putin. And he won't do it from exile. He will do it from Russia. And he knew that Putin won't invite him for a chai around the samovar just to discuss the future of Russia. He knew exactly what his fate going to be, or give or take, and he's still doing that. And his wife, now widow, Yulia, by continuing this and knowing the risk, even doing that from abroad, I think for me, they are my heroes. As villains, since the same person that you chose, I select. It was mine. It was my villain last year, and by choosing Navalny, by default, it makes Putin as the villain. So I'll take someone else. Maybe you won't, and it's Jeff Bezos. And my bone to pick with him in his intervention not to publish an op-ed in support of Kamala Harris in the Washington Post. When the publisher intervenes in freedom of speech, in a democracy, then for me it becomes a villain.
Are there any other oligarchs you'd like to upset, Latika?
No, I think my villain would be Assad, because I think what has come out about the scale of his death camps and the extortion rackets. There's an excellent piece on websites by AFP where they have worked out that Syrians were kidnapped, taken into detention, and their families extorted for thousands and thousands of dollars. Most of them, of course, never saw their loved ones again, but the extortion continued. I think that is a scale of horror that we probably didn't even imagine that was particularly happening. So I think Assad gets villain of the year, and his cowardly flight to Moscow and then trying to blame Putin for that is just the icing on that one. I think I'm not going to say this is a hero, but I think it is worth pointing out that Ursula von der Leyen is one of the few leaders to have managed the pandemic and been re-endorsed. There are very few leaders around the world who survived that COVID, incumbency and inflation curse, and she did. And she has pushed through very, very difficult reforms. And I think Europe goes unnoticed, but there's been some quiet achievements on Europe's side. She's been a reformer of the European project, and I think the European people are very lucky to have had her at this point in time, and it's not a surprise to me that they've re-endorsed her.
Latika Bourke, Charles Hecker and Yossi Mekelberg, thank you all for joining us. You've been listening to The Foreign Desk. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and indeed next year. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota, Chris Chermak, and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.